It's really interesting to consider that in the context of the fact that those contracts leaked from Pfizer, which were showing Pfizer basically telling countries in the global south that you have to put up collateral above and beyond what like G7, G8 nations are doing in order to secure vaccine supplies. Asking for stuff like them to put up their embassy and to indemnify Pfizer in case of even like Pfizer's intentional wrongdoing and harm, because there's, and of course, like Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla is like going around being like, well, only rich countries bought the mRNA vaccine because it's, high technology and expensive and was really designed for rich countries anyways. And I asked the poor countries and they just didn't want it. And it's like, well, that belies the fact that the ask of these poor countries versus the rich countries were, the administrative burdens on securing the vaccine were like 3-4 times what they were for the United States because of this sort of manufactured position of being exploitable and extractable and not, worthy of the respect from this like, global supernatural. I don't know. It's like Pfizer's like an extra state property, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that the kind of lens of anti-imperialism really reorients us to as well is that, right? Is the relationship between the state and capital. Because I think there's often multiple things happening. And of course, there's the kind of capital and corporate capture of the state. But I think oftentimes the kind of leftist analysis that suggests that the state is like withered away and the state has no control over itself. And capitalist interests control the state. What imperialism reminds us is that actually state and capital have always worked together, right? Mm-hmm. And particularly if we look at, like you point out, the relationship to the global south, the relationship to extraction around the world reminds us that the state is completely complicit in that it's not just that it's capitalists running around extracting and making a profit, but also that they're buttressed by the state and state's imperial interests of ensuring the underdevelopment, the deliberate impoverishment and extraction and exploitation that it relies on, right? Like there's no other way to put it other than the wealth of the West relies on the exploitation and plunder of, people within its borders and people beyond its borders. And it needs to sustain that through imperialism. And that requires the state and capital to work in tandem in order to maintain that system of deep exploitation. And I appreciate that you're bringing up Pfizer, because there hasn't been a lot of attention in recent years on the economic dimension of imperialism, right? Like of organizations like the World Trade Organization, that only 20 years ago were like the target of social movements, right? Like the WTO protests in Seattle, and then the FTAA in Quebec City. But then there's really just been a turn away from that internationalism. And so I just appreciate that you've been noting the internationalist kind of aspect of struggle, and also this current reality, which we have to deal with, which is, we need the abolition of these institutions.
Absolutely. I mean, we wholeheartedly agree here. And I think, one of the things, obviously this is like probably most immediately evident and like top of mind right now for people in the context of what's going on in Palestine. But it was so interesting to me to read some of what you were writing about sort of the historical connections and the early like anti-Black connections that you have between immigration laws in the United States and, this sort of idea where citizenship was weaponized against Indigenous struggles. And, it's just so fascinating. We had Adam Johnson on the show for the most recent episode, and we were talking about the sort of lie of the two-state solution and the sort of perpetuating genocide that's going on, whether it's a like quote unquote legal war crime or not. And that there's this sort of like that legality is really, it's conditional, right? And you write about this a lot in your book as well, which is the idea that people have to be made illegal. Would you be open to getting into some of the sort of like foundationally anti-Black early stuff like the Dawes Act at all?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. And I think, for me, thinking through that really came from a number of different places, and two of them in brief were just that a lot of times we think of indigenous struggle, Black liberation struggles, and migrant struggles as separate, right? Or at best, kind of as parallel struggles in solidarity with each other, like tied together by this loose idea of racial justice.
Right.
But, we don't see them as made through each other, right? Or as constituted through each other, which does a number of problematic things. The most obvious of which is that, of course, it assumes that migrants are non-Indigenous and non-Black, when in fact we know historically, but even contemporarily, that a growing proportion, for example, of migrants coming from Mexico and Central America are Indigenous people, right? They get subsumed into a kind of problematic pan-Latinx identity, which completely erases, in many cases, the specific relationship to settler colonialism of Indigenous peoples who have been captured by Spanish states and Spanish colonialism.
Right.
And also, of course, of Black migrants and refugees who are, also moving, and especially globally. And so, to make those separations erases Indigenous and Black people who are captured by border controls and who are, again, disproportionately impacted by detention and deportation because of the ways in which state surveillance works and the ways in which anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity work, means that, they're at the most impacted in the quote unquote undeserving category of migrants, right?
Right.
But in terms of the historical formation, I think it is important because then we see how the border really was made through anti-Indigenous and anti-Black genocide. And, one of the arguments that I try to make in Border and Rule is that in order for the border to be anti-migrant, in order for the border to be the kind of exclusionary anti-migrant regime that we know it to be today, it was necessarily anti-Indigenous and anti-Black, right? Like those are the foundational violences of the border, even if that is not the kind of mainstream, even left depiction of the border today. And there's a lot of history there, so I won't try to repeat it all. But in short, one of the ways in which the border worked against Indigenous peoples was to capture Indigenous nations. The very formation of the U.S.-Mexico border was born in conquest, the capture of 525,000 square miles of territory after the annexation of Texas, and then after the 1848 or the prior to 1848 and what resulted in the 1848 treaty. And so that literally captured Indigenous nations and subsumed them into the U.S. nation state. And today the border continues to be an act of war on sovereign Indigenous nations whose land is torn apart by the border. Todoniodom is one of the most militarized communities in the United States. And, some of the surveillance towers in Todoniodom are built by Elbit,
right.
Who is, an Israeli corporation who built their entire kind of business plan is built on providing nation states like Israel and the United States with a post 9/11 national security, anti-terror, weapons and security systems. So, we see these synergies with Palestine. We see these synergies with settler colonialism and the ways in which settler colonialism captured Indigenous peoples, and citizenship was a pillar of that by making citizenship contingent on private property ownership, parceling out and partitioning Indigenous lands into fee simple property, and by forcing Indigenous peoples to accept U.S. citizenship, right?
Right.
To no longer be sovereign nations. And this continues today, right? Because again, today, a lot of times Indigenous people are subsumed into the rhetoric of racial minorities, which of course a lot of Indigenous people will dispute, right? And say this is not an issue of minoritization, this is an issue of conquest. And citizenship was a pillar there. And here, I think another historical piece that's really important is that, some of the first fights against deportation in the United States that predate the fights that most of us know of, right? So the fights that most of us know of are, for example, Chinese exclusion. So when we think of historical anti-immigrant legislation, we think of Chinese exclusion federally or at the state level. But very few of us know that some of the first battles against deportation were actually of Indigenous peoples who had come in from Mexico and Canada. So the Chippewas and the Yaquis, for example. And they were facing deportation as quote unquote foreign subjects, as quote unquote foreign Indians. And that was some of the first battles against deportation were of indigenous peoples, right? Who were fighting and saying, we don't recognize this border. Like, this is part of our homeland, or, these are our relatives. This is part of the territory that we have historically and continue to affirm jurisdiction over or have relations with. And so, that's, I think, an important piece to understand in relation to the history, some of the histories, the uncovered or lesser known histories of anti-deportation battles. And when it comes to anti-Blackness in the border, shortly after 1848 and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, there was the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act.
Right.
And the entire premise of the Fugitive Slave Act was to capture Black people, right? It was for slaveholders and slave catchers to capture enslaved people. And one of the first formations of the Border Patrol, before it existed formally as the Border Patrol, but its origins were in vigilantes, Texas Rangers, KKK, who patrolled the border not in order to keep migrants out, but in order to keep Black people in, to prevent Black people from escaping, right? From fleeing into Mexico or elsewhere. And so I think, knowing the history of how the border was founded in anti-Indigenous and anti-Black genocide, again here, in order to, quote unquote, deport Indigenous people and to contain and control Black people, that is how the violence of the border started to build up. It shows us, right, that again, in order for the border to exist as an anti-migrant pillar or as a form of anti-migrant violence, it really has been built up through the state processes of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous genocide. And I think the last thing that's important about that is it again shows us that, the border is not really about movement per se, right? Like the earlier conversation we were having about how the migrant crisis isn't about everybody who's moving. It's intended to control certain people. The fact that these are the origins of the border, I think further help illuminate that border controls are not only about controlling movement, but they're about controlling movement in certain ways, right? They're about making certain people precarious. They're about capturing labor and people in particular ways that upholds, racial citizenship and racial capitalism.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.